Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today we're going to talk about cash grabs. What is a cash grab? Why is that term used? When is it used? Why am I talking about it today? And going into the whole conversation. And I'm going to start off with why I'm talking about it today. What's the prompt for this particular video, this particular topic? And the answer to that is just seeing the term a lot. Seeing the term a lot being utilized specifically on crowdfunding campaigns. When a creator comes out with a game and they go ahead and get accused of, it's a cash grab. It's just a cash grab. That's the only point. That's the reason it's a cash grab. Whether you're talking about, the newest Deceased Zombicide game, whatever it is, or alternatively the Nemesis campaign, every time they release a new update or expansion or add-on, anytime a company comes out with a new game that has some familiarity to an old game, that term often comes up. That or an IP in general. If it's based on an IP as well, that term comes up. But the term cash grab is thrown around, and it's utilized very freely to, in some way, accuse a company of doing something, I guess, bad? The term seems to be bad. The implication seems to be bad. This is a cash grab. That's the point of it. It's not meant to be good for the sake of being good. It's just a cash grab. And today, we're going to have a small conversation around different levels of art, of the creation of art, of why it exists, of what people's motivations are. And I think that there's like 6 different tiers. And to be very, very, very clear, I think you could break it down into 17 tiers, and I think you could lower it to 3 tiers. I just have 6 different tiers of what I'm going to go through, of what I think the creation of art versus monetary incentive is, and then we'll come back to cash grabs at the end. Because I think breaking down those tiers are helpful to starting the baseline of when is something eligible to be called a cash grab? When is that term accurate? When is it a catch-all for some sort of just phrasing of, I don't like that thing you made, so I'm going to go ahead and call it a cash grab? There's a lot of things to get into. But let's start off with those 6 tiers of art and creation. But first, coffee. Tier 1. Tier 1, the highest and purest, is going to be art for the sake of art. The art is created for the sake of art. It's not created with any monetary incentive. It's not created to sell. It might sell. It's just art for the sake of art. That is the incentive. That is the drive. Any other drive at all in any way is completely optional, secondary, non-important. You may sell it, you may not sell it, but that's not the reason you're creating it, and it doesn't affect the performance of any kind in any way, shape, or form. You are creating art because you want to create art. I don't think anything in the board game space falls into that category. Let's start off with that. In fact, actually, let's talk about what falls into the categories at the end of it. Tier 2, creating art for the sake of art, creating art for the sake of art, but caring how it does perform on the market. Selling it is a factor, but it doesn't affect your artistic vision. You don't compromise on your artistic vision for tier 2, but you are selling it. Maybe it's helping to fund your, your income, your dollars, your this, your that, you're paying your bills, whatever it is. But while you are creating art for the sake of art, and while you are selling it, and while you do care how it does, you're still not being willing to compromise. This is where I said you could lower the tiers too, because arguably tier 1 and tier 2 are very similar. There's incidental selling going on, but the nature of the end product doesn't change. If you're actually not willing to compromise on your vision, then it shouldn't be that different than tier 1. So tier 1, tier 2, I debated breaking them up or not, but I did partially because of subconscious bias. Either way, they're broken up. Tier 3, creating art for the sake of art. The reason you're doing it is still to create art, but you are willing to compromise on aspects of said art for the sake of higher sales. Now, not to a large extent. You're still creating it for the sake of art. Your primary drive and motivator is still art, but hey, you're willing to have conversations around ways to increase sales. And again, every media form is going to be different. It could be a movie, it could be music, it could be a painting, it could be a board game. Every media form will have differences as far as what does it mean to compromise on art. In the case of board games, I don't even know where we'd go with this, but maybe your own particular version of how you would put the fonts on the design of the game are different than what your graphic designer suggests as being much more readable. Maybe you went ahead and had one of those fun little logos where you can read the name upside down and right side up, but you can't actually read the name. But if you really know the name, if you already know that the name is whatever, you can go ahead and read it upside down and right side up. And so maybe that's an area where you compromise on, because the people you're talking to point out that it's harder to sell a game if you don't know what it's called. If you're just like that one game with the cool box, but I don't know what the title was, there might be reasons or whys or ways that you compromise on aspects of your vision, but ultimately the primary motivator is still the creation of art, and what you compromise on is not integral to what you are building. Okay, that's tier 3. And again, we'll get into where I think board games fall and where different types of board games fall at the end. Tier 4, creating art for the sake of sales, while still feeling the need to deliver art as much as possible. Okay, so tier 4 is going to be your primary motivator at this point is the fact that you need to sell things. That is your primary motivator. Now keep in mind, you can still be an artist while being in tier 4. People have to put food on their table. You can still be an artist, start off as an artist, chose a career as an artist, all motivated by the sake of art, while still feeling that sometimes you have to produce for the sake of sales. You're still trying to create art. That is still something that's a factor. It's still important to you, but right now, in the moment of what you're creating, the driver isn't art for the creation of art and the sake of art. Rather, the driver is the creation of art for the sake of sales. Very often, the difference between tier 3 and tier 4 is going to be when someone embraces something because it's their passion. They start off in tier 3, and then when they choose it as their career path, ultimately you're going to find yourself winding down into tier 4 because, and again, it doesn't have to be board games, it can be anything. You know, you started making music because you thought it was really cool and awesome, and you chose that as a career despite being a lawyer, despite everything your mother told you. But now you are creating music. Now you have to go ahead and do gigs. Now you have to go ahead and continue to put out music. There is an incentive to create your next album because you have to put food on your table. Very often people will start in tier 3, transition to tier 4, and then depending on how well tier 4 goes, sometimes they can go back to tier 3 if they are incredibly successful and just don't need it to worry about things as much. And very often people will be stuck in tier 4 for the rest of their lives as long as they choose to remain engaged in that whatever hobby, aspect, whatever the art form is. Tier 5. Creating something, I'm no longer calling it art at this point, creating something for the sake of a sale. It would be great if it were also art, but that's only incidentally relevant. The main driver is the sale. The art is completely incidental to the point of creating art for the sake of the sale, meaning at this point, yeah, it might be good to have better art for the sale, and you do still have that vision of better art is good, but it's no longer an important contributor. Meaning the incentive drive between tier 3 and tier 4, the main incentive of why you're doing it's shifted. The main incentive was art, and then tier 3, main incentive art, but you care about the monetary aspect. Tier 4, you care about the monetary aspect, and that's the main incentive, and yes, you also want it to be art. In tier 5, it starts moving down into, okay, like you still do value art, and art may still help out the sale, but at this point, the main primary motivator is the sale. In tier 6, and again, tier 6 and tier 5, I debated whether they could be the same thing as well. I do strongly believe in 4 tiers at the very least. 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, I debated whether they need to be distinguished. But tier 5 and 6, well, tier 6 is going to be creating something for the sake of a sale. Again, something. Creating something for the sake of a sale. Any relevance to actual art is only important insofar as it drives the sake of the sale. You could not care less about the art. It is not a motivating factor at all. Again, in tier 5, you still care, but it's taking a lower back seat. And in tier 6, you just don't care. There may be a presence of art, but only because sometimes good art can drive a sale. So you try to mimic art wherever possible, but it just doesn't matter. That's just not the reason you're doing things. Which is where we start going into conversations around cash grabs and where do board games fall. See, I believe most board games that you'll buy. There are board games that exist that are possibly in tiers 1 and 2, but I think they are the exception. Again, tier 1 being, complete obsession with the art and only art. Tier 2 being art, but you're unwilling to impact said art for the sake of a sale. I think compromises in almost any board game you ever buy are going to be present. There has to be some degree of compromise. You may have wanted to create X, but anything you mass produce almost inherently has a degree of compromise to it. I think it's hard for me to believe that there isn't some degree of compromise once you go from creating an individual piece to being able to mass produce something. The compromise might be in the type of material you wanted to use to create the best vision. The compromise might be the fact that it's mass produced at all. The compromise might be any number of different things, but inherently to mass produce things, you're working with larger degrees of restrictions, and in order to do that, you are inherently doing so, meaning people are always working with restrictions. If you're painting a canvas, you might not have access to all the colors or materials or anything you want, but your lack of access might just be a limiting factor, not a factor you limit in order to be able to sell it, if that makes sense. If I can't get my hands on, what is that, like the ultra black dye that one person bought and no one else can use? If I can't get my hands on that, that's not a compromise for the desire of the sale, that's just a practical inability to get my hands on it. Versus if I use a card stock because that's the options in front of me, the reason I'm not doing something myself is because I'm trying to sell it. So I believe nearly all board game creations that you buy, that you have the opportunity to buy, start off at tier 3. That it's being created for the sake of art, while aspects of what you want to create are being compromised upon in order to sell it. I think that is the most common way that most creators start. Someone starts off in the hobby in some way, shape, or form. They find the hobby, they fall in love, and somewhere along the way, they decide to create. Maybe they see all those games on crowdfunding. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just played something good and they wanted to create. Whatever the inspiration is, they decide they want to create because they're in love with something. They might be in love with drawing and it's just a medium to work around. They might be in love with the actual hobby and wanting to create a board game that someone else can play. But there is some degree of a drive to create, and that brings people forward in board games. And at some point, they start trying to sell that thing, and that's when it moves to tier 3 almost inherently. Again, I'd be fascinated to see if there could be a tier 1 or 2 with something you've actually bought. I just don't think so. I think or if it's so, I think incredibly uncommon. But so you start trying to sell that thing. You start trying to figure out, okay, great, I want to bring my vision to life. It starts off as a drive for art that happens to involve sales at the same time. Sales is a motivator to some degree, but your primary motivator is a desire to create. Nearly everyone in tier 3, by the way, has another job. This is not their primary income. It's just almost inherent to it. Well, at least at first. Because then people shift to tier 4. Tier 4 is where you start being motivated by the fact that you need money. Money is the primary motivator, but art is still an important aspect of it. Art is still a huge aspect, but you suddenly quit your job. You've decided to go ahead and, I don't know, whatever. You quit your job and now you're creating board games. And you did that because you had a successful crowdfunding campaign or whatever the reason is. Maybe you're just not the most risk averse and you decide to go ahead and jump for it. But at this point, suddenly sales are an important concept. Whether you're paying for yourself, whether you're paying for a family, sales and the monetary incentive is suddenly a huge reason why you have to create. And suddenly you're in tier 4. You're creating art for the sake of a sale. And that shift occurs the second that you're working on your next board game because you're mindful that it's necessary to put money on your table, to pay your employees. As soon as you realize that, you're in tier 4. Not as soon as you realize that, as soon as that becomes the drive as to why you're working on your next idea, you're suddenly in tier 4. If you become successful enough, you get to be George R. Martin and go back to tier 4, back down to tier 3 again, where sure, eventually you'll finish that book, but you don't need the money. You're not in a rush. You'll create it when you need to create it. There's not a drive to put out something inferior in order to hit a timeline and start selling. Your pure and only drive goes back to being art. But again, you have to be really successful to go back to tier 3. Tier 4, you're going to stay in for quite some time. And so now, you're trying to create the next game, and you're being mindful that yes, you want to sell it, but you also still care about the art form. Now you can move to tier 5. Tier 5 is an unfortunate place to be, and I think tier 4 can easily be called a cash grab, because that's the whole point of this video, right? Calling things cash grabs. Tier 4 can easily be called a cash grab. You're creating something that I view as because ideally, let's say Zombicide Deceased, right? Or Deceased, a Zombicide game. When you have Deceased as a Zombicide game and it's called a cash grab, I think a lot of the incentive for that is people see a lack of creativity and an easy way to sell more things, and they say, well, that's a cash grab. That's no longer something that's... And again, everyone's going to have their own level as to what you call a cash grab. For me, I wouldn't call tier 4 a cash grab, personally. Tier 4 I would not call a cash grab. If you still care about art, if you still care about creating things that are good, I don't know if I'd want to call it a cash grab. Because you still care about art. You're still trying to do something good. And so I'm okay with that. Tier 5, when you're creating for the sake of the sale, and art might still be in your mind, but it's not really a huge factor, I can understand calling something a cash grab at that point. I can understand that kind of pulled back. But even then, it's complicated. Because what is the downside of a cash grab? What is something that lacks value? Meaning, effectively, Zombicide Deceased. The Deceased is a Zombicide game, which also, disclaimer by the way, we did paid content on the channel around Zombicide Deceased. I mentioned that because I'm talking about Zombicide Deceased, although it's not actually about Deceased. This is just a generic conversation. But when you create something like Deceased, there are lots of people, clearly, who want it. There are lots of people who buy it. There is some degree of demand being fulfilled. The people who want more Marvel Zombies, but with the DC universe. That is a demand that's being fulfilled. And so, what is the downside of a cash grab? What is the reflection of it? Because the motivation for that is likely in tier 4 or 5. I don't think it's in tier 6. I think there's still a desire and a care to put something good out there. But I'd guess that it's tier 4 or 5. That you're either creating art for the sake of the sale, while still trying to be as good as possible, or you've kind of moved to like creating it for the sake of the sale, and art is a factor you care about, but it's not the main driving factor at all. It's kind of the back of your mind. That's entirely possible, especially as you move more towards a corporate mindset to a larger company scale. Although again, even companies like Simon are still small comparatively speaking. I think for me, where cash grab becomes a negative term, for me personally, not negative term, the concept of a cash grab, for me, would be more entrenched in the idea that what you're selling isn't going to deliver value to the end consumer. That's where I kind of draw the line. Because I understand the desire to call something a cash grab based on just seeing that same thing again and again and again. It's the 17th Zombicide game. It's the 18th Marvel United game. It's the 3rd Nemesis, and there's paid add-ons and extra characters and all these things. And what are you actually making that's different? I understand the appeal. Whether it could be Call of Duty or Battlefield, any number of different games that just rely on the fact that there's a customer base who's willing to continuously buy it. Or you take something established and suddenly you have tiny epic Game of Thrones. And suddenly you're like, well, that's just a cash grab. That's just taking an IP and a system and a series and combining them for the sake of the sale. But the end result might still be a good game. The end result might still have love, care, and affection poured into it. And the end result may still satisfy many people's cravings. And so the idea that we just label things as cash grabs is an interesting one. And I don't necessarily know what the downside of a cash grab is when people want that next thing. There are still people who want the next Assassin's Creed game. There are still people who want the next Call of Duty title. There are still people who want to watch the next Marvel movie and get enjoyment out of all of those things. And I think for me, calling something a cash grab, when there is clearly some degree of care poured into its creation, and when it is making people happy along the way, I think it minimizes the creation of that thing unnecessarily. I think it often reflects our own personal frustrations with our own desire to spend less and not be tempted by certain things. Well, you know what? I didn't need Tiny Epic, whatever, but now it's Game of Thrones. I kind of want it. And that frustrates me. And so I'm just going to call it a cash grab. I'm going to call it you cashing in on the IP and trying to get another sale out of it. And sure, that might be a factor. For most companies, for most creators, the drive to incentivize a sale is going to be present. But that doesn't mean that they're not trying to create good things along the way. I would say on my end, personally, I am far more inclined to call something a cash grab after that thing has arrived and delivered and has been verified to be absolute garbage, which is rare, frankly, but it does happen. I'm more likely to call it a cash grab then, but even then, to some extent, I'm potentially minimizing care that was put into it, even if that care didn't actually result in a good thing. But I'd say I'm far more willing to label as a cash grab when the end result didn't deliver. When you have a game that delivers, or a movie or a TV series, or anything that delivers, and clearly the end result just wasn't good enough, and suddenly that exchange of value, the fact that you cashed in on an IP, on an existing franchise, the fact that you try to motivate the sale, and all those things resulted in the thing being created and delivered, but not enough care being put into it actually being a good product, at that point, to me, that's when it feels like a cash grab. To me, it feels like that exchange, the ideal of a mutual exchange where I give you money for something that I want, now becomes I gave you money for something that you tempted me with, and it isn't something that you should have sold to me. That's why I am more inclined to use the term. I think that's easy to be frustrated by the reprints out there in crowdfunding. I think it's easy to be frustrated by the amount of things that we want and the limited choices we have as far as what we can spend money on. I think it's easy to rain at other people's parades. I think it's easy to look at every single miniatures game that CMON puts out and talk about how it's another, appeal to the horde of CMON fanboys who will buy anything they put out. It's easy to be frustrated. But don't yuck on someone's yum. Live your life. Ignore the campaigns you don't want to buy. Ignore the campaigns you do want to buy and feel tempted by, but you're kind of struggling with it. Ignore them. Walk away from them. You don't need to rain on someone else's parade. I think more often than not, most of what is created in the board game space, there is care about the end result. There is a desire for a good product, a good game. And if it doesn't show up, and if it really is disappointing, and if it really is something that so many people vilify as being just not a good experience, call it a cash grab then. Say that they didn't put their due diligence into creating a mutual exchange then. But doing so while so many others are clearly happy with what they're buying and are clearly looking forward to what they're getting, it just starts to feel like it's a you problem. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.